So, have you heard of Mundaun yet? It's a fully hand-drawn 3D horror game that came out pretty recently. Maybe not the very first of its kind, but definitely one of the most visually impressive. Gameplay-wise, it shares many similarities with the classic adventure game genre, exploring places, acquiring items, and completing puzzles to progress on to the next area. However, it's still a horror game at heart, and the scratchy, hand-drawn visuals lend greatly to that aesthetic. But what does hand-drawn mean when it comes to 3D games anyways? I mean, it's not like everything you see is the work of a pencil. You can't just make a few models, hand-draw the textures, and instantly replicate Mundaun's unique art style. Whether you're interested in game dev or just the cool visuals, I think that knowing what's going on behind the scenes helps you appreciate the game a whole lot more. Plus, it might just inspire some people to make more unique art styles in the future. To properly study the graphics, I did a fair bit of analyzing while I played, and the developer was nice enough to answer the rest of my questions via email. So with that knowledge in mind, let me try and break down what makes Mundaun look so fresh.
Like fresh.
The models are mostly low poly with plenty of big triangles and sharp corners, but they're not the typical flat shaded style that some people think of when they hear low poly. Models here do feature modern smooth shading, which basically means that the edges blend together like you'd expect. You could liken the polygon density to games of the PS1 era. I mean, as I covered in an old video, PS1 style indie horror games are still very popular today. Although, Mundaun doesn't look like any game from that era, nor is it trying to mimic the hardware limitations. If you had to ask me, I would definitely not lump this in with the rest of the PS1 throwback genre. Like most games, Mundaun features heavy use of baked lighting. Baked lighting is light that's pre-calculated and stored in textures, so the engine doesn't have to compute it in real time. However, there are a few real-time lights in the game, things like the lantern or the headlights on the car. Obviously, these light sources need to move and cast shadows, so baked lighting wouldn't have cut it. Real-time lights are very expensive performance-wise, so many games opt for limiting their use, and Mundaun is no exception. Nothing really out of the ordinary here. Mundaun makes good use of particles throughout basically the whole game. Unlike most games though, the textures of these particles are all hand-drawn. As far as I'm aware, all particles in the game are 2D objects that are always facing the camera. This is common in almost all games, although modern games often mix in 3D particles here and there. Things like smoke, bees, and snow are all very clearly 2D textures that you can only see head-on. The majority of the game uses the engine default standard shader. There aren't any crazy effects going on with the models or textures here. An opaque shader with a color texture and shadow support is all you'd need for most objects in the game. However, there are a few things here and there that likely use custom shaders. Foliage is one example. Notice how the grass and tree leaves sway in the wind? Most games achieve that motion in the shader, instead of physically moving the object. Water is another good example. Notice how things reflect off the surface of the water? Also take note of the subtle ripples across the surface. Definitely the work of a custom shader here. Then there's a handful of effects that apply to the whole world in subtle ways. Things like bloom, which causes bright areas and lights to glow slightly. Or ambient occlusion, which adds a little extra shadowing to edges, corners, cracks, and the like. And you can't forget about the heavy fog, which helps set a spooky tone in just about any game. Pretty standard fare overall. If I can paraphrase the developer for a moment, anything too fancy would work against the textures, which are the main means to create the aesthetic of Mundaun. Textures are likely the most talked about aspect of this game. As you know, they're all hand-drawn, which is both impressive and time-consuming, but not too technically challenging. You see, when you model a 3D object, you mark seams on certain edges to UV unwrap it. This is the equivalent of creating an origami cutout of your model, taking the 3D object and placing all of its polygons onto a 2D surface. At this point, texture artists generally take that unwrapped model over to their painting software of choice, whether that be Substance Painter, Photoshop, or any of the countless alternatives out there. Some even prefer to do the painting directly in the 3D software. But hand drawing textures adds a whole new layer of frustration to the process. You have the unwrapped texture, so you must first print that out and use it as a guide on where to draw. You also have to keep your modeling software open at the same time to refer to the position and orientation of each polygon on your piece of paper. If you had just unwrapped your model with the default settings, parts will be all over the page, and not even necessarily right side up. When you're happy with the drawing, you must then physically scan the paper back into your PC and then re-import it to your 3D software. If there's any minor issues, it's back to the drawing board. Literally. Redrawing small bits of the texture to scan and re-import will eat up quite a lot of time. On the other hand, the developer mentioned this in regards to the workflow. In the grand scheme of things, the texturing, even if done by hand, is only a very small part. If we're looking at the big picture here, the textures certainly stand out a lot, but there could be countless other things that ate up way more work time. Overall, this work style is somewhat punishing for mistakes, requires a good bit of experience, and discourages tweaking models too much after they've been textured. Normal texture artists don't have these issues to nearly the same degree. As Aldous Huxley once said, "Perhaps it's good for one to suffer. Can an artist do anything if he's happy?" Maybe he was onto something. If you had asked me before if I thought that making a hand-drawn 3D game was a good idea, I would have said absolutely not. But the dev managed to pull it off, and it really shows. Mundaun is a labor of love that deserves quite a lot more attention. Are there any other games out there that you constantly think back to for their art alone? I'd love to hear about some of your favorite visuals in the comments. We all might just find some cool new stuff to play. Or possibly topics for some future videos? Who knows? As usual, if you enjoy my content, then subscribing is the best way to help out the channel. Either way, I really appreciate you sticking around through the whole video. I hope to see you all next time. Have a good one, folks.
Quite fine.